Diamond in the Rough by RKBoogyman. It was a beautiful autumn day. It was warm with a gentle breeze. The sky was so clear and so blue. The air was crisp with that special autumn smell. Leaves, wood, smoke flying free from the fireplaces throughout the town and along the route. I could hear the melodious cries of Ninkata in the far-off distance, even through the closed window. Yes, all of that was outside, and I sat inside, oblivious to it all. I sat in the overstuffed chair in an awkward and lazy pose, one leg over the left arm. I had a bag of potato chips propped between the arm and my other leg. Sprawled out as I was, it was obvious that I was definitely not very ladylike. As I munched on the salty snack, I aimlessly flicked through channels with the remote control. I had to fight with it a little. It was a new universal, a necessity after Gorbo, our herdier, chewed up the remote that had come with the television. She chewed up everything. I could hear that annoying grumble and chewing and slobbering noise behind me, as she likely gnawed on some toy. Don't get me wrong, I love that bundle of fur. It's just hard to concentrate on these same boring channels if she's chewing and making some mouthy sounds. I was already annoyed about the lack of things on television. Pokémon League highlights were on one channel, a cartoon on another, and some news interview on yet another. There was always something on regarding Pokémon. There were training tips, and snippets about types and strategies. A skitty came up on screen and seemed to have caught Garbo's beady little eyes. She growled and hopped in her idiotic manner to the side of the chair and barked at the image. "Garbo, hush," I scolded. "It's not real, you can't chase it. It's on TV, you dope. TV!" I let out another annoyed sigh as she continued to growl. It was cute when she was a lil pup. It's just downright aggravating now. "Stop yelling at her," my mother scolded gently. "One day you'll be glad that she's so hypervigilant." I looked around, very awkwardly, behind the chair to see her drying the dish. She was the stay-at-home type and seemed to only be capable of conversing whilst in the midst of cleaning something. Sometimes she spoke with a duster, another time it would be the dish, like now. Sometimes she'd be polishing silv, oh, you get the idea. She was thorough and happy to be that way. Hypervigilant for what? I asked before releasing the tension in my muscles and nearly bonging back into the original sprawled position, facing the TV. Garbo let out a bark and leapt onto my torso, knocking over the potato chips and hopping about my body. She licked my face and I sputtered as the nasty drooly mustache dripped into my protesting mouth. Yuck. Garbo, get off. The spring from my body wasn't any less annoying. It knocked the wind out of me. The whole ruckus knocked over the chips, as I said, and they spilled all over the floor. Dutifully, Garbo was quick to gobble them off the carpet, sucking up crumbs and leaving no trace of the accident. "Marauding potato chips?" my mother suggested with a laugh. She sure seemed to find the whole thing funny. I didn't. "Why are you even in here?" she asked. "Go outside and play. It's such a beautiful day." "Play what?" I asked. "What can I say? I was in a lazy mood." "Look for deerling," she suggested. They were rather commonplace in the meadow and along the tree line of the woods. "How about just going for a walk?" She made that last suggestion with a bit more emphasis. "Walk?" Garbo's ears perked and she darted towards the door so fast that she ran into it. Face first. She just couldn't stop in time. What a dumb Pokemon. Still, it made me laugh as I sat up and watched the whole scene over my shoulder as I stretched. It looked like I had been outvoted. Up I got and put on my windbreaker. Once outside, Gorbo's tongue lolled from her mouth and she tore off through the fallen leaves. They flew up from the gust she left behind. My mother handed me a small backpack. I smiled, kissed her on the cheek, and accepted the bag. I assumed she packed a small picnic for Gorbo and me. It likely also had a few necessities. "Go, my little trainer," she teased. I smirked, rolled my eyes, and waved as I attempted to find a way to walk without tripping over Gorbo's insane and scattered running fits. She was small, but she also had a head like a rock. As for my mother's comment, she had always wanted me to venture off, like a lot of the other kids, and pursue something involving Pokemon. Don't get me wrong, I love Pokemon, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to run around hunting and battling. And hearing about how comfortable everyone's shorts were. Frankly, the closest I'd ever get would be if something popped out of the tall grass while Gorbo was with me. Gorbo stopped short, only to fall flat on her face in the dirt. Her attempt to turn on a dime to chase a Pidove that had landed to examine the feeder had failed. Maybe it wouldn't hurt so much after all to look for a Pokemon of my own. Gorbo was more of my mother's Pokemon anyway. I think I'd want something more interesting, more useful, and less clumsy. Gorbo and I walked along the path, avoiding the tall grass for the time being. I watched her, now that she was at a more agreeable pace. Her mouth was so wide open and her tongue still lolled out, drool dripped from the end. She panted so heavily, it almost sounded like ha-ha. It actually made me smile. She looked up at me and gave her eyes a squint, as if to emphasize how happy she was to be out and about. We walked past a pond and Gorbo stopped to take a drink. It gave me a chance to look around and decide what the next plan of action would be. Going home wasn't an option. My mother would just shoo me out. I didn't want to bother my father at work. There was a meadow not far from the pond and a big hill. I figured that a picnic would be a good idea after all. To be sure, I whisked my bag around and looked inside. My assumption had been correct. There was a nice little picnic and a little blanket. There were 2 fizzy sodas, a small dish, and a bottle of water, presumably for Garbo. There was a first aid kit which contained the normal human first aid items, as well as some Pokemon first aid such as antidotes. There were also 3 Pokeballs. Honestly, I sighed aloud. Garbo perked and looked at me. I took one out and held it to her face. "Can you believe Mom put these in here?" Garbo simply tilted her head as if either confused about my annoyance altogether or by the Pokeballs. After all, she rarely went in hers. She immediately began to sniff around and wag her tail as she headed towards the tall grass. I could only assume she was following the scent of some such Pokemon in this favorite hiding place. Since she was going in the direction I had planned, I simply followed behind curiously along the clear path, beyond the perimeter of the tall grass patches. She perked and let out a bark, running with great purpose into the grass and vanishing within it. Then a yelp came out before she fled towards me into the safety of clarity. Right behind her was a Meowth. It leapt from the grass and bounded after my Harrier. They wound and wound about my legs, causing me to grow dizzy. Bravely, I reached down and snatched the feline Pokemon up from the scruff. It drooped and looked at me with a little meow and a big grin. This one was tame. An older woman bred Meowth in town, so it was pretty easy to narrow down the owner of this one. I didn't see the woman anywhere, so that left one other person. "Carlos," I called. I held the Meowth out as if it were a dirty rag and glared at the grass as the boy stood up. The creep had been crouched like some sort of ninja, it seemed. He laughed and gave the Pokeball a little toss. Garbo, the fool that she was, went chasing it that short distance. It clicked and it opened, and out came the red light as it took the form of the inhabitant. Unable to stop myself, I let out a scream and fell backwards on the ground. Garbo too let out a yelp and ran to me, but then turned back with a growl. Carlos pointed and laughed so hard he hiccuped. Beside him was a Beedrill. It turned its ugly bug-eyed head to the side in a tilt and made a little buzzy noise. Yuck, I hated bug Pokemon. Butterfree and Beautyfly were the only exception. Everything else was so gross. "I scared you! I scared you!" Carlos cheered. "Glow is scared of a Beedrill." He said that last part in a teasing sing-song manner. He then turned to the ugly thing. "Hey Juju, what do you know? We scared Glow." That little poetic rhyme just annoyed me further. "What is wrong with you?" I accused. "It's a giant bug." "Hey, bug Pokemon can be great Pokemon too," Carlos defended as he gave the Beedrill a stroke. "Don't listen to her, Juju. She's just mad because she doesn't have any Pokemon." "I have Garbo," I shouted. I don't know why I was stupid enough to take the bait. "Garbo is your mommy's Pokemon. You don't have any of your own Pokemon. I have 2. I bet you don't even know how to battle." "I don't have time for this," I spat. I attempted to walk past him, but he began taunting again. It grated my nerves. I spun around angrily. "Fine, will a battle shut you up?" Carlos seemed a little surprised at first, but then grew a smirk. "Yeah, show me what you got." "I only have my Harrier, so you can only pick one of yours." Silly me, I had hoped he'd pick the Meowth. Obviously, Oscar wasn't going to be on this battle's roster. He picked Juju, that stupid Beedrill. Of course he did. I honestly had no idea if Garbo had ever battled another trainer's Pokémon before. I had never paid much attention to what my mother did with her. She had to have done something with her for Garbo to have evolved. I didn't know what any of her battle moves were. It was just then I realized just how bad off I was. Carlos motioned for Juju to face us. Garbo hopped forward and snarled. "Juju, use Attract," Carlos shouted. I perked curiously. Garbo perked curiously. Nothing happened. After about a minute of silence aside from Garbo's growl and Juju's buzz, I realized that the attack had failed. Okay. Now what? Garbo, use something. Yeah, that sealed it. I was bad trainer material. I didn't know a thing about this Pokemon. She looked at me a moment with an expression I swear could have translated to, "Are you freaking kidding me?" However, she wasn't as dumb as I thought. She lunged for the Beedrill and took a big bite and zapped it with some mysterious power. Juju steamed for a moment and dropped. It looked pathetic. "Juju!" Carlos cried. "No, get up! You killed my Beedrill!" "Get a hold of yourself," I scolded. "It's just paralyzed. You're lucky, Garbo has a nasty habit of chewing on things." "You cheated! Your Herdier knows Thunderfang!" I rolled my eyes at his whining. Garbo simply sat down, scratched her ear, and then darted into the grass. Carlos forfeited. I didn't have a Paralyze heal in my bag, so it looked as if the Pokemon Center would be the next stop. Yeah, I'd have to go. He demanded it. Juju went back into the Pokeball and Carlos wiped his eyes. "Relax, Carlos," I sighed. "Juju will be fine. The Pokemon Center is just over there. He'll be back to his normal, disgusting self in no time." This seemed to make him feel better. We just came back from the former side of the pond before we heard Garbo's insane barking again. We both turned to see a monstrous shadow zip out of a particularly tall patch of grass. I had never seen anything that big around these parts. Apparently Carlos hadn't either. I wiped my eyes as the sun gleamed around its frame and cast into sort of shadow. I let out a gasp when I realized this giant Pokemon was a Beautifly. Impossible. Beautifly were not much bigger than Carlos's Beedrill, yet this one was 3 times the size. It hovered over us. Garbo kept jumping and snapping in hopes of grabbing it. It began to flap its wings harder, sending a powerful gust towards Garbo. It blew her back and rolled her like a tumbleweed into the pond. She wasn't exactly swift or graceful when wet. Her reaction speed was greatly diminished. "Garbo!" I cried out. As clumsy as she was, I never wanted anything bad to happen to her. I was powerless. Garbo was a sloshy mop, and Carlos's Beedrill was paralyzed. Suddenly we heard a loud hiss, and a golden coin bonked the massive Beautifly on the head. It slowed its flapping and looked towards... That's right, Carlos still had his Meowth Oscar. "Go get it, Oscar," Carlos and I cheered. Oscar hissed again and leapt up to scratch the buggy face. It was definitely enough of a distraction for Garbo to climb out of the pond and shake herself. Now a bit lighter, she charged just as the Butterfree whipped its long tube mouth at Oscar. I dove forwards to catch him. He was unhurt. He was up on my head in the next instant and leapt towards the big bug again. Another scratch got the right wing. Garbo was finally able to grab it, now that it had lost height. We could only watch as the Pokemon attacked this threat without relenting. I don't think either of us have ever seen a dead Pokemon before. There it was, though, a big, dead Beautifly. Oscar sauntered back proudly and recollected his coins. Garbo was still swinging her head from side to side as she chewed on the carcass. "Ew, Garbo, stop it, stop it!" The dumb thing tried to drag the body with her. I admit, I was impressed to see her drag the thing as far as she did. Quickly, we ran towards the center of town and the Poke Center. We stopped just outside to catch our breath. I realized that my mother was right. Garbo knew something odd was nearby and fought to protect me. Perhaps she wanted to chew it, but regardless, she protected us, with serious help from Oscar. Speaking of Garbo, she finally scuttled up, having been lagging behind. She held up a big piece of the Beautifly happily and even pranced about to show it off to anyone nearby. Inside the Pokemon Center, there was a small line. A woman was talking to Nurse Joy. Complaining would have been a better word. Not sure why. When Nurse Joy returned 2 Pokeballs to her, a little boy and a little girl rushed over to collect them from her. Immediately, they released their Pokemon to play. Looked like an Espeon and Umbreon. Either one of those would be really neat Pokemon to have. "Welcome to the Pokemon Center," came Nurse Joy's voice. "Can I help you?" When I turned to face her, Carlos was already handing over the Pokeball containing the Beedrill. He also called Oscar and presented that Pokeball as well. Garbo wandered over to the children with Espeon and Umbreon. She tried to play only to get an annoyed bop on the head from Umbreon. It didn't seem to hurt her. She tried to show off the bit of bug, but that was the end of the game. The kids grabbed their Pokemon and ran to the woman. The Pokemon, however, peeked about their master's shoulders to look as they were taken away. "Garbo, drop it," I ordered. Instead, she pranced around the center to show it off. I left Carlos to try and take the thing from her. She began to frolic about with it then. This was a fun game to her. It wasn't to me. Thankfully, sometimes she could be as dumb as a brick and she slammed into the legs of another person. He let out a cry and bent over to rub his shins and stuck in a breath. As I said, Garbo had a hard head. She wagged her tail and tried to show off her prize again. The man wore glasses and a lab coat. One of those scientists. His eyes went wide when he saw the bit of a bug in Garbo's mouth. "What is that?" "The biggest beautify I've ever seen," I told him. "She's proud of it and I can't get her to give it up." "Your herdier isn't very obedient, is she?" he asked. "She's more my mother's herdier. I don't have any Pokemon." He nodded and then grabbed onto the piece of the carcass and, despite some protest from Garbo, was able to free it from her and take a look. He fiddled with his glasses a moment and then looked to me. "Where did you find this?" "By the pond," I replied. "I can show you." He agreed, and now that my obligation to Carlos was over, I led the scientist named Lewis, I think, to the carcass. It was still there. He whipped out a pocket camera to take pictures and then took notes. "It is very big. I'm surprised you didn't catch it." "Catch it? Oh, no. I forgot that I had Pokeballs. I should have caught it. Why didn't I?" "Oh, right, because I was terrified of it. I don't care if it's an exception to my bug Pokemon hatred. That thing was way too big." "Do you know why it's so big?" "Not offhand," he admitted. "There are Pokemon that get horribly big. Giant, really." "It's a very interesting mix of genetics and environment, though," he laughed. "You could have caught this one and taught it to fly." I was not amused. "Yeah, well, I didn't catch it." He fiddled with his glasses again and stood up. "I'm gonna take this back to the lab to study. It was such a nice specimen. Save the parts your herdier chewed." I'd say it gained a lot of experience from an opponent this big. Lewis bent down and pet Garbo, much to her delight. "If you ran into a few more battles, I wouldn't be surprised if it evolved." "Terrific." I rolled my eyes. The last thing I need to do was evolve Garbo into a Stoutland. That would only encourage my mother's crazy idea of me needing to become a trainer. "Thanks," I said politely. "I'm not interested in battling anything else. I just want to go to my picnic. That is, if I don't have to worry about another giant bug trying to get me." Lewis grinned. "I doubt it. I've not seen a giant Pokemon around here, so this may have just been a freak occurrence." He gave a slight chuckle. "If you do happen to find another giant, you should catch it." Garbo began to bark and run about again. I rolled my eyes and bid Lewis a farewell, left the dead giant to him. I was then on my way to the hill beyond the meadow. Needless to say, I was a little anxious. You don't just forget something like that. However, I was soon at ease again. The only Pokemon I saw from there on out were mostly Pidove, a Purloin or two, some Deerling, and a Swasbuck. I almost wanted to catch the Purloin. Its dark colors and yellow contrast were just so attractive. I decided I was in no mood to weaken it, and take it back to the Pokemon Center. I decided just getting to my destination on the hill was best. Once there, I set up the blanket and made sure that Garbo had something to eat and some water in the dish provided. I then got comfortable to enjoy the lunch and a fizzy soda provided to me by my mother. It really was a nice day. I can't believe I almost missed it. My gloomy mood from earlier had gone entirely. I felt uplifted and relaxed. I would have laid myself back, but that would have left me open to the drooly kisses of my herdier. She was running up and down the hill happily. It made me a little nervous. I didn't want her to be sick after all. Before I knew it, the sky had begun to turn orange. Was it really sunset already? Had I really passed that much time? I stood and looked around. I could see the city in the distance. It stood as a shadowed skyline during the day, but as dusk crept in, I could see the glimmering lights. It was the signal to start home. Granted, I didn't live too far away, but it was still a good hike. It was enough to walk about during the day, and another matter entirely once it became dark. I packed up the blanket and the dish. I also put the trash in my bag as well. There weren't exactly any trash cans way out here. I stopped suddenly and listened quietly. I could have sworn I heard something. There it was again, that strange rustling. The hill didn't have a tall grass, so I could see very clearly. There are no wild Pokémon in my sight. I looked at Garbo. She perked, so I knew she heard it too, yet she didn't move. I followed the noise and tried to place it. It sounded like dirt hitting dirt. Well, that was the sound of the little tunnels Garbo would dig once they began to collapse. I didn't see a hole, however. I walked carefully with the bag now slung on my back where it belonged. I then saw a small patch of dirt. It was hardly noticeable and easily missed, but I saw it. The dirt was cracked a little. Visually, it wasn't that odd. It hadn't rained in a bit, so the ground could very well have started to dry out. That, however, was where the dropping dirt sound came from. Muffled. I got on all fours and then poked at the cracking earth. A small hole poked through. I gasped. There was an opening. Was something digging underneath me? I stood carefully, not wanting to upset the fragile ground. One step, then two, and up came Garbo. She hopped up on her hind legs and began to hop. She caught me by surprise and I fell backwards. I heard the ground give away and I let out a cry as I fell back, unable to see where I would end up. I opened my eyes. Oh, I was so sore. I could see the moon overhead. It seemed so far away. It was so dark now. Had I been unconscious? It had only felt like a moment, but apparently it had been much longer. The little bit of moonlight flittered into the deep cavern, but only just barely. I sat up and rubbed my head as I looked around, and back up to the top of the hole. Oh, Gloria, I scolded myself. Now what are you gonna do? It was so dark. It would have been nice if my nickname had been an ability. Glosher would be useful. I heard shuffling, which pulled me from my thoughts. I saw a glint here and there. I heard husky breathing. I let out a sigh and tried to calm my heart. Garbo, you startled me. It would figure that she'd follow me down. Perhaps she fell too. Perhaps she was too dumb and hopped down rather than go for help. Well, maybe not so dumb. Who knew what sorts of things would be lurking in the cavern? She was the loyal sort. I watched her glistening eyes. I couldn't really see her, but I could smell her. She just had that dog smell. I could hear her paws scratching at the ground. I could hear her raspy breathing and quiet whimpers. I crawled over to her and reached out a hand into the darkness to pet that little mop. Well, she wasn't so little anymore. She seemed a bit taller now. I pulled my hand back and wiped it on my pants. Gross, she was so wet and muddy. I could hear water dripping somewhere in the dark, so I assumed she had gone to whatever underground oasis was nearby for a drink or a game. I stood up and began to pat my clothes. I couldn't see if it made a difference or not. One last glance to the hole seemed to verify that I would likely not be getting out the same way I came in. I reached out carefully and tried to feel for some sort of a wall. The cavern was vast, surely, for something like this. There had to be an exit somewhere. How bothersome. The walk didn't bother me. I knew there was an exit somewhere in the area, just not so close. The issue was the inability to see. The journey would take so much longer if I had to creep along like that. I felt a hole and began to stumble. Garbo, however, gave me a huge nudge. It changed the direction of my stumble and I found a wall. Can you see in the dark, Garbo? I asked her. I reached out to pet again. Indeed, she was taller. Perhaps it was like Lewis said. Perhaps she had battled something in the cave while I was blacked out. Perhaps she had evolved. I amused myself with the thought of her carrying me home draped over her back. I dismissed the thought with a chuckle. Even though Stoutland were a bit larger, it wasn't by that much. Still, they were strong Pokémon. Apparently they were also very keen in the dark. I felt her push and nudge this way and that against my legs to guide me about the obstacles. Her snarls kept the chirping woobats at bay. Her body and paws dragged and scratched on the ground. Anything along the ground would know she was there to protect me. I felt rather safe and, for the first time, I trusted her so completely. I stopped to rest often. I wasn't severely hurt in the fall, but I did hurt. I was also growing tired. I had no concept of time in that void. I knew it felt like forever. At one point, I even dozed. Again, I have no idea how long. It could have been hours. It could have been a few minutes. The snort woke me up. I reached out and grabbed a handful of wet and muddy fur. She yanked herself forward with a grunt. It was even enough to pull me to my feet. Then, there was more walking. I held onto Garbo for a while. She walked with a strange waddle. I began to wonder if perhaps she had gotten hurt in the fall. If so, she made no real sign of it. I couldn't see for sure. She was quieter than normal. She was also tense and cold. Well, I couldn't blame her. It was rather chilly in the cavern. It was also full of mysterious noises. I was rather tense myself. Are we almost there? I winced and slouched after what felt like several more hours. I felt her duck back, and she rammed me forward. I didn't want to fall on my face, so I scrambled about. I was able to keep my balance, but I was surprised how aggressive Garbo had become. The nudging wasn't so strange. There was almost a certain level of pushiness that was familiar. This level, however, was just too hard. She must have been just as eager to go home as I was. I felt my knees, luckily in a clear spot, and whimpered. "I wish you knew Flash," I cried. She let out a gurgle and I heard a clicking sound. When I opened my eyes, I could see. I smiled so wide that my mouth was open as much as it could be. I cheered and began to hurry forward. I could see some glimmering around the bend. I hurried around the bend and stopped short. It was a dead end. We had gone in the wrong direction. Normally I'd have been furious. The stupid Hurdy or Stoutland, or whatever she was now, led me in the wrong direction. I couldn't seem to understand how furious I should have been, though. My mind seemed to go blank for a long moment as I took in the room. Rainbows. There were rainbows everywhere. It was so beautiful. The light from Flash radiated enough to bounce off a whole horde of gems. It was like some painting out of a storybook about dragons. There were gems everywhere, and in the rocky walls, dangling like stalactites and piled up all over the ground. Prisms, all of them. And the gloomy cavern was painted with such a radiant display of colors. The whole spectrum, all of it, melded and wove this way and that. Garbo let out a huff behind me. I went closer to the horde to examine all of the different gems. I looked down after stepping on something. I picked it up and realized it was a bone. It was broken. It was then that I realized that there were several bones strewn about. Some were broken like the one I had initially found. Some of them were chewed, some were whole, but all were picked clean. On a rock shelf was a skull. I assumed it was human, yet I hoped I was wrong. In the empty sockets sat a pair of gems embedded so carefully. I reached out to touch the skull nervously. It was then that I noticed the red on my hand. I had picked up the bone with my left hand. I touched the skull with my right. I swallowed hard and looked closer, wondering if the mud had been some type of red clay. It just didn't seem to be the right color. I felt a wave of nervousness fall over me and I looked down at my pants and the red smears. It was then that I realized Garbo, no matter what evolutionary stage she was in, was unable to learn Flash. It began to come together as I was afraid to turn around. I could hear the huffing there. I swallowed hard and looked at the large gems in front of me. My eyes went wide and I felt the terror rise. I could see the reflection. The whole time that I wandered the cave, I had thought that perhaps Garbo was an idiot leading me this way. It was intentional. It was a trap. I pressed my eyes shut and then looked at the reflection again. I could feel the pain in my lungs as I realized that I had been holding my breath. I had to force that stammering exhale. I had to face that form. Slowly I turned around and trembled at the confirmation. Garbo hadn't evolved. She hadn't even led me all this way. She'd been so tense and so cold because I'd been handling a corpse. Her body dangled, not muddy but bloody between strong jaws. The glimmering had not been Garbo's eyes, not her drool, but the eyes and glimmering ornamentation that I watched my own fearful reflection staring back at me. The noises, the nudges, they came from a Sableye. He had been slinking about, and now he stood with Garbo still in his mouth. He snarled a little. The gems he had for eyes glimmered. Slowly it began to pull off my bag. I still had Pokeballs left. Maybe he was a jealous sort and wanted to come with me? That's the hope I kept telling myself. He had led me along, showing me the horde. It obeyed my request for Flash. It could have attacked in the dirt, yet it didn't. Stay there, I urged quietly as I knelt down slowly and began to rustle in the bag. He tilted its head curiously with a gurgle. He was huge. Sableye were not common in these parts and normally stood over a foot in length. Not this granddaddy. It was almost as large as I was, a good 5 feet tall. Like the Beautifly I had seen before, this Sableye was a giant for his kind. I pulled the Pokeball from the bag. He drumped Garbo's lifeless body and stretched himself closer, as if warily examining the ball. He licked his bloody face with his long tongue and grabbed his mouth a bit. After hours of holding its prey, he likely felt the relief of being able to move his jaw freely again. I gave the Pokeball a toss and it simply bounced off his head and rolled to the ground. He looked at it a moment and then began to pace. Each pace led him closer and closer. I backed up until I was pressed against the rocky wall and slid down to the ground. "Please stop," I whispered pleadingly. I shut my eyes tight, only to feel those claws stroke my face and pry them open. It was unnerving being so close to that face. His breath smelled like rot. He had hopped back and gave a little sneeze. He hurried to the pile of gems and began to dig. I could breathe again. Perhaps I was right. Maybe Garbo's death was due to her trying to fight him off. Maybe he was just very territorial. Maybe the bones were from ancient people. I thought all sorts of explanations to calm myself. I had to think of these logical things. If I didn't, I'd be stuck wondering about the frightening and negative things. Would I ever get out of this place? Would I ever see the sun again? Would I ever see my parents? I'd even be happy to see Carlos and his ugly Beedrill at this point. Crunching caught my attention. I looked over and saw the Sableye perched atop his mound of gems. He munched and munched so casually. His teeth screeched along the gemstone a little. It reminded me of silverware against the plate or a nail on the chalkboard. There weren't any other sounds to distract from it. By now, I was breathing almost normally altogether. He seemed so happy to eat the gems. I rested my head back with a sigh and closed my eyes. In the next instant, however, something was shoved in my face. I actually nearly choked. The Sableye had shoved a big gem in my face in an attempt to force-feed me. I spit it out and coughed, confusing him. "No," I shouted. "I don't eat that, no!" After a long silence, I sighed. "Please, I want to go home. Take me back out." He didn't seem to like that. It was evident by the scowl on his face. He hurried over to Garbo's body and brought it to me. He shoved her face at my face, trying again to feed me. Again, I spit and sputtered and began to cough. He put her down and flopped down in a squat with a huff. "I want to go home," I repeated. "You can come too, if you want." Maybe that would sweeten the deal a bit. He didn't seem too keen on leaving, however. He glanced at his horde, and then to me. He let out a screech so loud that I had to cover my ears. "I can't stay," I shouted. "My eyes are meant for daylight. I belong up there." He tilted his head and began to dig once more in his horde. While his head was under a bunch, I boldly began to crawl towards the entrance of the room. Perhaps I could find my way back. Suddenly, I felt him tackle me and bite down hard on my right arm. I screamed in agony as he dragged me back and gave me a heavy toss into the pile. I whined and groaned as the sharp edges poked into me. As hard as he threw me, it wasn't hard enough to go beyond some scrapes and scratches. I couldn't help but let out a yell of frustration. What did he want? Why wouldn't he let me leave? He was suddenly right up in my face, to the point that all I could see were his large blue gem eyes. I couldn't even make out the reflection of my own eyes. My breathing was short again. I didn't want to smell the rot, and he pressed his knees into my torso. He held up 2 gems. They were 2 different colors. He had set his head back far enough to put the gems between us. I see, I said nervously. Still, he stayed there. Slowly, I reached up and placed a finger on the sparkling green gem. The Sableye beamed and pushed hard off my body to dart back into the pile with a happy chirp of sorts. He came back a moment later and happily held up a pair of round, cut emeralds. They reminded me of the diamonds in my mother's wedding ring. He sure was proud of them. I closed my eyes and rested my head back. I could hear him making little noises. He scrambled into a new position and pulled my eyes open with one hand, then dangled one of the emeralds. I said nothing this time. He seemed so desperate to show them off since I had chosen them. Then I could hear him put the gem down and he began to point to my eye. It wasn't comfortable. I didn't like things so close to my face anyway, and his sharp claws there didn't make it any better. I clenched my teeth as it poked gently at the white of my left eye. Carefully, I brought my hands up to his side and tried to pull him back slowly. Suddenly, he let out a grunt and plunged his claw about my eye. I jolted and let out a scream. He pulled back and I could feel the tension of my optic nerve. Now that my other eye was wide open, he went for that one too. He had them now, tugging gently at the nerve. I gripped tightly around his body, but his skin was thick and he didn't seem to notice or mind. I didn't want to throw him. He had my eyes in his hand. I cried out and howled. I panted as I tried to calm myself. I let out a whine. Suddenly, he pulled on one nerve until I felt a snap, then the other. I rested there on the pile, whimpering as he moved away. I reached up to feel the vacancies and the mess left behind. There was darkness. He had taken away the light. I sobbed for quite some time. I'm not sure if he had gone away, or not at that point. It wasn't until I quieted down from my exhaustion that I heard his little noises again. I honestly thought I felt helpless before. Now, I felt completely helpless. I was more at his mercy at that point than I ever was before. I felt him nudging my hand. He forced me to pet him, much like a cat would do. His skin was thick and leathery. I could feel his body rumbling with what I could only assume was a purr. He had the nerve to snuggle up with me. I was too exhausted and out of it to really retaliate. Despite the anger, the anxiety took precedent. I didn't want to be anywhere near the Sableye or the Horde. I didn't want to be in the cavern. Still, I had nothing to hold on to for comfort. Garbo was gone and nobody knew I was down in that hidden place. The only thing that was alive to hold was the Sableye. I don't know how long I was there. It could have been days. I couldn't tell the difference anymore. I lifted my head as I heard him shuffling about the Horde. I felt his presence beside me. Then I felt his claws on my face. I wanted to protest. I even tried. I remember grabbing his hands, but I was too weak to do much. I just whimpered helplessly as he began to press at the sockets. I could feel the pressure of something being forced in. The roundness and the sharp cuts. I was able to deduce it was the emerald he had shown me. It took a lot of care and quite some time for one, then the other. He then took my hands and placed them on his masterpiece. I could feel them. They were so smooth. He then placed my hands on his eyes to show that they were the same texture, same shape. They were the same. He purred proudly. I made a little noise. I was unable to react anymore. I don't think I'd bother even if I could. I was already accepting that I'd be at his mercy for as long as I was alive. I'd never get home. I was home. I had my own Pokémon. All of my own. More precisely, he had me. That was Diamond in the Rough. Final thoughts? Very good, but very slow. First, the good about the story. The idea of Sableye kidnapping someone and replacing their eyes with gems is a very creepy idea done very effectively. I like the reveal that Garbo wasn't the one leading her, however, I think it might have been made just a little too obvious. I think that scene could have used just a touch more subtlety to make it more effective. As for the bad parts, my main complaint is just how long it took to get to the point, more or less. Nothing relevant to the ending even starts until 2/3 of the way into the story, and nothing creepy happens until the last quarter. I can understand the character development in the beginning of the story, but 65% of the story doesn't relate to the ending at all. When you're able to delete massive chunks of the story and still have it make perfect sense, there's probably too much filler. Having character development as filler is fine, but weaving character development into the story progression is much better. Despite the room for improvement, I thought this story was quite good, and I look forward to seeing what else RKBoogyman does. That's it for this week's Creepypasta. Tune in again next week when we tackle yet another story made and sent in by the fans with Palette. If you want to write your own story, help peer edit a story, or even just read the stories early, check out the description where you'll find a link to the Creepypasta section of my forum. You'll also find a link to the playlist of every Creepypasta reading I've done. If you're interested in keeping up with my blog posts, join the Facebook fan page linked below. Remember that if you want your story to be read on the show, you must stay active on your post on the forums, as well as read the forum rules. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, sweet dreams.